Let's take a look at how to add information in Metadata Manager. I'm going to start from the Metadata Manager login page and enter my username and password and click Login. When I first log in, no publications will appear. The two that you can see here are ones that I've added previously in this test account. This area where you first arrive in Metadata Manager is called the home page or the desktop. So you can see publications that you've added already, although there won't be any to start with when you first log in. You can also see the account that you've logged in with. And if you click on the drop down, you've got links there to our tutorial and to our help materials if you get stuck while you're using Metadata Manager. In order to show you how Metadata Manager works, I'm going to be using an example journal article to deposit. The metadata that I use is going to be based heavily on this real example of a journal article. And I've prepared in this document the metadata that I'm going to use to create the records. It's important that I don't copy and paste directly from here the metadata into Metadata Manager, because I might accidentally pick up some formatting and submit that in Metadata Manager, and it could cause problems later on when the metadata that I've submitted to Crossref is used by other systems. So in order to make sure that I don't do that, I'm going to copy all of the metadata that I've added that I want to put in, and I'm going to use a plain text editor. Instead, I've just pasted all of that text into my plain text editor, and now I can be sure that I can copy and paste it from here without taking any formatting with me. Back at Metadata Manager then. One big difference when you use Metadata Manager compared with, for example, our web deposit form is that instead of just adding each article directly, you start by creating a journal container. This is a record for the whole of the journal itself. And you do this whether you're creating a journal completely from scratch or whether you're trying to edit content that you've already submitted to Crossref using a different route. Let me show you how you create the journal container. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to search for the title of my publication to make sure that I haven't already added it. It's easy to tell at the beginning that you haven't added it because you will have no publications or only a few publications visible, but it's good practice to search for it every time so that you get into the habit and you don't accidentally create a duplicate by mistake. Here I can see that I don't already have a publication called eLife, so that means I'm okay to go ahead and add it. What I'm doing here is I'm creating the journal record or the journal container, and the metadata that I enter here applies to the whole journal, not just to a particular article. I'm going to copy and paste from my plain text editor the information into each field, starting with the journal title and then the journal URL. If I have a journal abbreviation, I can add it here. And next, I need to add a journal DOI, and this is a little different from what we're used to. We're used to creating DOIs for individual publications, but this DOI applies to the whole of the journal. But you do it in exactly the same way as you create your other DOIs. You start with your prefix, which is assigned to you by Crossref, and then the suffix is a string of characters that you create, and you have control over which ones you use for which elements of your publication, whether it's for the journal itself or for individual articles. Next, I need to add the ISSN, whether it's print or whether it's online. And if you have both, do please put both in there. My publication is online only, so I'm only filling in online ISSN. I can also set the language for my journal. This you should use if all of the publications in your journal are always in one language. Otherwise, you can set this at the level of each article that you add. And finally, I set my archive location. Part of the member obligations that you agree to when you join Crossref include making arrangements for archiving of your content to make sure that it's available for the long term. In my case, I'm choosing clocks as my archive location. and then I click Save. I can now see with the blue banner at the top that the system has saved my journal record or my journal container. So I can close that now, and publication eLife now appears on my desktop. I can now go into this publication and start to add individual records. If this is a publication that I've already deposited content for, using a different deposit method, I can also retrieve articles from this journal that I've already deposited with Crossref in order to edit them in Metadata Manager. And to do that, you would search for the article that you've previously deposited in this field, and you would then be able to retrieve its metadata, edit it in Metadata Manager, and resubmit that information to Crossref. But in this case, I'm going to add a completely new record, one that I haven't previously put into Crossref. If I use volumes or issues, I have the choice to add those, but the article I'm adding today is just a straightforward article without any volumes or issues. The form in Metadata Manager is really nice and simple to use. I just need to go and put the right metadata into each field on the form. I'm going to start with my article title. This is a required field. You can see that because there's an asterisk next to the field, and it's also marked there, the asterisk against the blue background. I have some optional title data that I can add if it's relevant. This is where I would put, for example, the details of translated works. And I now need to add an article DOI for my publication. And just like before, you determine your article DOI according to the suffix string, the rules that you create, a string of characters there. I also need to add in my article URL. This is the URL that people will use to access my content. Next, I need to add the dates, whether it's print or whether it's online. My publication is online only, and there are two ways I can add the date. I can use the drop downs to add the year, the month, the day individually, but I can also click on the calendar and go back to the date that my article was published and add it that way. If I have a first page and a last page, I can add that in these fields. And there's also room to put in an electronic location ID or an article ID that I might use locally in my system. The last part of this section is a space for the abstract. The abstract is really important for discovery because it's a place where people might find keywords in your work that will lead them to it. And it also will give them an encouragement to want to read your document, even if, for example, it's behind a paywall. So it can also act as a useful steer there for readers finding your content. The next section is all about contributors, largely authors, but also editors too. And the first decision I need to make is my contributor an individual or is it a group? If my contributor is a group, let's say, for example, that everybody at Crossref collaborated to write a document, we could just put in our group author name here. But in the case of my example today, I'm just going to show you what to do to put in the first name of an individual contributor. In this case, I'm going to copy the first name and the family name. There's space for the suffix if the person's name has a suffix, for example, junior or senior. And there's also a space for their affiliation, if, for example, they work at a research institution. There's a field for their ORCID ID. It's really important to put this in if you have it. And lastly, there's a space to show their role, in which case they are an author, and so on. And I can continue to add more contributors as I need to. The next section is about funding information. This is where I put in the details of the organisation or organisations who contributed to funding the research. And when I enter a name, Crossref will search in the background in the funder registry for a match for that name. And that's what you can see happening here. I click on that to accept the official form of their name. This will automatically in the background also match to their funder ID, which is really useful when people are searching Crossref. They can search by the funder ID to make sure that they've got exactly the name of the organisation that they mean to search for. There's a space also for me to put in the grant number. And it's possible for me to add new award numbers if there is more than one to add. And it's also possible for me to add another funder if there was more than one funder for the work. The next section is about license information. The license that might apply to your work could be an open license such as Creative Commons, which is the case for my example here, or it might be a proprietary license. In this case, it applies to the version of record, which is the version of this document I'm entering metadata for here. If my license has an embargo, I can add the start date here. And if my material is usually under a proprietary license, but for a short time or for a limited time, it's available free to read, I can add that here. If it's an open license though, such as Creative Commons, all I need to do is add the license there without any other dates. It's very straightforward. The next section is where I add the references from my article. To keep things simple, I'm just going to put in 3. Each one is on its own line. I'm going to click Match References. This is where you can really start to see the Crossref magic working in the background as the system searches Crossref's existing metadata to see if it can find a match for each of these references and a DOI with it. For each of the matches that it returns, I can click to review the match and make sure that it really is the right document or work that I intended. And if ever I discover that it's not a correct match, I click reject. But if I'm happy with all of those 3, I can just proceed and they will be deposited automatically when I submit all of this to Crossref. There's a space for me to put in a related item. And I do that by adding its identifier, which in this case is a DOI, but there are lots of other sorts of identifiers I can use. And I can also add in the relationship type. So for example, I can put as preprint and this item is the preprint of which the current item is the version of record. It's possible for me to add more related items such as a data set if that's appropriate. Finally, under additional information, there's a space for me to enter my similarity check URL. There's also a space for me to specify the language of this article. And it's also possible for me to specify the archive location. In this case, I already did that at the top level of the journal, so there's no need for me to repeat it here. I'm ready to review this now, so I'm going to go back up to the top, and I've got several options under Continue. If I haven't finished adding all the metadata that I want to, I can just save this, and it will keep it on the system, but without depositing it, and I can come back to look at it later and add more details then. I could straight away add it to my deposit cart, but really it's best to review anything before you submit it. And this nice compact summary screen shows me in one go all of the information that I've just added, and that will help me to review that and make sure that I haven't forgotten anything. If I'm happy that everything there is accurate, I can add this to deposit. and it will then show up in this area called To Deposit. This is a little bit like the shopping cart that you might be familiar with if you buy anything online. You can add any number of records to your deposit area. This is where they sit before they're actually deposited to Crossref, and you can deposit them either individually or wait until you've got a greater number of them and submit them in one go. In my case, I've just got the one item that's ready to be deposited, so I'm selecting that, and my action, I've got some choices here, but I can move that record, I can duplicate it, remove it, or I can transfer the title if that research object is changing publishers, for example. Now in the To Deposit view, I have the option to go ahead and deposit my content to Crossref. It will tell me if my deposit has been successful or not. In this case, unfortunately, my deposit has failed. I've engineered this example on purpose to show you what a failed deposit looks like, because the good news is it's easy to find out what's wrong with it and how to fix it. If you go to the triangle symbol and click on that, it will tell you what the error or the errors are. And in this case, the ISSN has already been assigned. And this is a completely reasonable outcome to expect, because as I said to you at the beginning, I'm using an example of a real article that exists already, which already has information deposited with Crossref. And here the system is doing its job and checking to say, hang on a minute, this already exists in the system somewhere. I think you've made a mistake. So in order for this deposit to be accepted, I would go back into the record, edit the ISSN, and then try to deposit it again. When you contact our support team for help with any problems relating to deposits, it's really useful to include your deposit ID. That helps them to track down exactly where in the system your deposit got to, and it helps them to help you resolve your matter more quickly. That's it for the demonstration. Let's now move into you having a go for yourself with Metadata Manager.